I just moved Nico Collins down to wide receiver 20 in my rest of season rankings after this injury, which I know may seem a little bit drastic for a lot of people watching this, because we can all agree that he is a top 5 wide receiver rest of season from a points per game perspective. What I really want to do is I want to dive into the strategy that we should be implementing by the time we are halfway through the season. Fantasy football is very different with how you should be valuing these players in comparison to how it is at the very beginning of the year. Now, we want to break this down in a couple different ways. One, I want to be breaking players into 2 different groups. One, these guys that are going to give you the short-term production, but their value is going to be going down over time. Those are the Jordan Masons, Chuba Hubbard, Jerome Fords of the world. And I want to be looking at the players that aren't going to give you the short-term production, but their value should go up over time. Those are the guys like Nico Collins, Christian McCaffrey, maybe Jalen Waddle, Tyreek Hill, Roma Dunze, Ladd McConkey. And I want to talk about which team should be targeting the first group of players and which team should be targeting the second group of players. But going right back over to this Nico Collins example, because I think he is the perfect guy to really hammer this point in on, because we know that he is elite when healthy. We saw it over a 5-game sample before he went down with the hamstring injury. When he gets placed on the IR in week 6, we have to go through and we have to look at exactly how impactful this will be. So him going on the IR guarantees you will be missing at least 4 weeks. That means with Nico Collins, he will not be playing weeks 6, 7, 8, and 9. And you have to remember that Nico Collins has his bye week in week 14. So at the very minimum, you have 5 games missed for Nico Collins until the fantasy football playoffs. Now, obviously, that number may actually be a little bit higher depending on if he comes back the second that he is eligible to return from the IR or not. But we can just give him the benefit of the doubt and we could say you're going to have Nico Collins missing 5 weeks until the fantasy playoffs get here. And then we go through and you look at how many games he will actually be playing. Well, say he comes back in week 10. You get weeks 10, 11, 12, 13. You get 4 weeks from Nico Collins at the very most that he can play before the playoffs arrive. So here, looking at a team that is fighting to inch and claw their way back into the fantasy football playoffs, you can't really hold on to Nico Collins. This is a player that is going to have a lot of value on a team that's 5-0, on a team that's 4-1, because they can view Collins and go, okay, well, we're pretty sure he's going to be in for weeks 15, 16, 17. I'm 5-0. I'm thinking about the fantasy football playoffs. Nico Collins will be a top 5 wide receiver for me then. I can actually use his production because I will be in the playoffs. Let me go ahead and let me trade for Nico Collins at a discount. Where it's actually funny, where we had a few people stop by the live stream last night and say, oh, Mason, I'm 5-0. Should I trade away Nico Collins? And my thought process is, how could Nico Collins possibly have more value on anybody else's team other than the squad that you are 5-0 on? So here in this scenario, if you are that 5-0 team, if you are that 4-1 team, you should aggressively be targeting those players that maybe the short-term production won't be there, but you will get that long-term upside for the fantasy football playoffs. Now, of course, when we say to aggressively target these options, is that to mean you need to trade for them right this week? Nico Collins goes on the IR in week 6, and we're going to go out and we're going to acquire him right away? No. Another funny thing to look at is the psychology of fantasy football players. And I would never come out and try to pretend that I'm the best fantasy football player in the world. You know I'm an idiot. I know I'm an idiot. That's a given at this point. But what I can say is, I answer more fantasy football questions than anybody else on this planet, and I'm damn confident with that, with us live streaming for 5 hours a day, answering questions every single day, pretty much for the entire year. So what I have been able to do is get a grasp on how the average fantasy football player works. And what we find is, we find that these players that get injured, while in theory, their value should plummet, where Nico Collins goes on the IR and he should lose half of his value. But every week that goes by, he should become a little more valuable, and a little more valuable until he is finally back, right? It should be a linear line up until Nico Collins is back and he's right where he was before. But what actually happens is Nico Collins goes on the IR. He loses about 40% of his value because people still remember the production and they still remember the player that he was. And then over the next few weeks, as he's not playing, when he's out of sight, out of mind, his value actually dips a little bit further. Even though 2 weeks from now, he'll be closer to returning from that injury. And in theory, he should be more valuable than he was, but he's actually going to be about the same cost if you wanted to trade for him, or maybe even a little bit cheaper. So with that in mind, I would say that if you are that team that's 4-1, if you are that team that's 5-0, instead of going and trading Jayden Reed for Nico Collins today, I think you're actually much better off literally waiting 2 weeks and going and making that trade then, because in my personal experience, I don't think the Nico Collins owner is going to be bumping his price up 2 weeks from now. However, I think that you can get the production from Jayden Reed over the next 2 weeks and then look to sell him when we don't have to deal with as many absences as Nico down the stretch. Now, one thing that I would look to acquire right now, regardless of if I was a team that's 4-1 or a team that's 1-4, is a free pick on Underdog Fantasy of Joe Burrow, more than less than half a total yard for the Sunday game. Of course, you can find that link in the description in the comment section. If you go over to Underdog Fantasy and use promo code FLOCK, you'll get that free pick, a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000, and a free team review in the live stream that we are doing every single night. And one of my favorite picks on Underdog right now is actually going to be for Jayden Reed to go higher than 59.5 receiving yards against the Arizona Cardinals, where you have a crazy high implied team total for this Packers offense. But let's move this over and let's go to the other scenario. If you are 1-4, if you are 0-5, and we need points right now, and you are sitting here with these options that have the long-term value but the short-term production, you need to sell them right this second. You need to get Nico Collins off your team. You need to go and you need to acquire a wide receiver in the Jayden Reed range that maybe is a little bit less exciting from a points per game perspective. However, you are going to get more points in general, increasing your odds to get to the fantasy football playoffs, because that should be your number one priority on a 1-4 roster. Very similarly, on a 1-4 roster, on an 0-4 roster, the guys that I maybe label as sell high candidates in videos like Chuba Hubbard as an example, where we're going, okay, in the long term, Jonathan Brooks is going to be in for the fantasy football playoffs. Chuba Hubbard's definitely not going to be a running back one. There for you, it doesn't matter, because if you're 1-4, more likely than not, unless you start winning games, you're not going to be in the fantasy football playoffs. So you should not be making trades and you should not be making moves to set yourself up with that possibility. So the teams that have the losing record, you actually want to be hoarding those guys like Jordan Mason, Chuba Hubbard, those players that are going to give you the short-term production but have questionable long-term roles, just because we need to stay in the fight. Now, one other thing that I do want to mention here as well is strategy with bye weeks. Now, this is going to be a little more important as we go through this season. Obviously, we actually only have had a few teams go through their week 5 bye so far, but it is definitely worth pointing out. So with a wide receiver like Amon-Ra St. Brown, as an example, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs, Saquon Barkley, all these guys have already gone through their week 5 bye. You're just going to be getting an extra game in comparison to every other receiver in fantasy. So honestly, I kind of use this as a tiebreaker, knowing that we have 10 weeks left effectively of the fantasy football season. So if you have a player that's already gone through their bye, you're going to be getting an extra 10% of games played on a baseline expectation in comparison to those players that have yet to go through their bye. So it's not necessarily something that we want to be making strategic moves over right now, but it is definitely a useful tiebreak. As an example of this, if I'm looking at Amon-Ra St. Brown in my rankings, personally, I have Chase, St. Brown, Lamb, Jefferson, all about the same in my rankings rest of season from a points per game perspective. But in a full PPR format, I think I could just say, okay, well, if I expect their points per game to be similar and I'm going to get an extra game from Amon-Ra St. Brown, maybe use the tiebreaker to go with St. Brown. Now, obviously, everybody's going to have their own take on those receivers. This isn't necessarily about those rankings. It's more so just the strategy behind it. But it's not as important right now in week 6 as it will be 4 weeks into the future. Because if you just do the math, if we say, okay, St. Brown's going to get an extra game played in comparison to Jamar Chase. Well, in reality, in week 5, that means you're only going to get an additional 10% of games played. Whereas when we get closer to, say, week 10, week 11, and you're looking at those players that have not gone through their week 12 or their week 14 bye, there it may actually make a massive difference. Because if we get to week 10 and Jamar Chase has not gone through his bye, and you only have 4 weeks left of the fantasy football regular season, then you're going to be getting an additional 25% of games played from Amon-Ra St. Brown at that point going into the future. Because one thing that we really have to keep in mind, especially as I set these rest of season rankings over there on flockfantasy.com, and people get very upset with me for maybe having Chuba Hubbard too low, is we're not ranking players based off their previous production. Instead, we are trying to rank players based off the future production that they are going to give you and the difference that they can make for your fantasy football team. So for a player to have gone through his bye already, it is a little bit of a sweetener. It's a cherry on top if you are targeting that option in a trade when we're sitting here in week 6. But when we get to week 10, when we get to 11, it will actually be a much bigger deal for those guys that have not gone through their bye, that they're going to be missing 1 out of 3 available games left in the regular season. Obviously, if you're a playoff team, that doesn't necessarily have that much of an impact. But also with those playoff teams, an easy move that you could look to make is pivot over to some of the rookies that may not be hyper productive at the moment. But what we have historically seen is rookie wide receivers in particular actually expand their roles as the season goes on. Where typically what you have is you have receivers that are playing a limited number of snaps, running a limited number of routes. But as we progress, as they become more comfortable with the playbook and the offensive coordinator and head coach trust them a little bit more, they'll be getting on the field more often. And what we want to be identifying in that case will be the receivers that may not necessarily be running a ton of routes right now, may not necessarily be playing 90+% of the snaps, however, are hyper efficient on the volume that they do have. So an example of this would be a player like Rome Odunze. So with Rome, I'm not excited about starting him at all. I mean, if you go through and you look at my week 6 rankings, Rome Odunze is much, much lower than he is in my rest of season ranks. But the expectation with this is with that rookie receiver, we're going to have the continued expansion of his role in the Chicago Bears offense tied with the rookie quarterback. You're going to have the continued efficiency gains of the Chicago Bears offense overall, which should backload a lot of this production for Rome Odunze, which should make it where you're very excited about having Rome on that team that's 4-1, that team that you are thinking about the fantasy football playoffs, whereas that team that's currently sitting at 1-4, obviously those rookies are a little less appealing because if they're not going to help you in week 6, they're not going to help you in week 7, they're not going to help you in week 8, there is something that you can almost just ignore. Now, going over to what we have with the roster construction at the very bottom end of your teams, one thing that's worth pointing out is when we have these one-off instances of the onesie positions have already gone through their buys, such as Jalen Hurts, such as Sam Laporta, it becomes very important at that point to really take a hard look at your roster and go, do I need my backup quarterback? Do I need my backup tight end? An example of this is I have Sam Laporta in the Flock League. So I'm sitting here going, okay, well, if I don't think there's a shot that I'm going to be playing this backup tight end over Sam Laporta at any point through the rest of the season, why am I rostering him? One, the only reason you could is if you think that you would be able to potentially package him and sell him for something better 2 weeks from now. Or 2, if you think that that tight end is similarly ranked to Laporta for you rest of season, and you think that there's a chance that you would play that tight end over Laporta straight up. Because if you have Cade Otton and Sam Laporta on the same roster, Laporta's already through his bye, and you think I will never start Otton over a healthy Laporta, there's no reason to roster the backup tight end. You go ahead and you cut them and you pick up a running back or a wide receiver off the waiver wire. And actually, we just updated the My Teams page on flockfantasy.com. So if you have your team linked, which obviously you can link if you play on Sleeper, Yahoo, or ESPN, you can see in the far right column that you actually have the best waiver wire options according to our rankings. And yeah, definitely use that if you ever need to determine, oh, okay, is this player worth a spot at the bottom of my roster, or what running back would I pick up? It's completely free for you on flockfantasy.com. I'm going over to the backup quarterback here. Same situation. Say you have Jalen Hurts already through his bye week, and you're sitting here with another backup quarterback that maybe has long-term upside that you're excited about, like Caleb Williams. My main thing I would ask you is, well, will you ever start Caleb Williams over a healthy Jalen Hurts? Because Jalen Hurts is already through his bye. And if you are never going to start that backup quarterback over your starter who's through his bye, it is okay to just go ahead and cut them, pick up an extra running back, pick up an extra wide receiver, and instead try to chase the upside of somebody like Zach Charbonnet. So obviously, I'm reviewing teams in the live stream every single night through flockfantasy.com. And one thing that I've noticed as I get to see a lot of y'all's waiver wire is I see guys like Zach Charbonnet. I see guys like Bucky Irving. I see guys like Braylon Allen that are sitting there when you're rostering Geno Smith as your backup quarterback. And my thought process is, well, if you have Jalen Hurts, there's no way in hell I'm ever starting Geno over Hurts. If I do, it's a marginal gap between the two. Who cares? Whereas if you pick up Braylon Allen, Breece Hall goes down this Sunday, all of a sudden you have a league-winning player that you got for free. So I would for sure rather optimize that bottom end roster spot with that additional asset that you have off the waiver wire at running back in comparison to the backup quarterback or backup tight end, especially if your backup quarterback or backup tight end's already gone through their bye week. But I think that's all I have for you. I really hope that I was able to help you out in some way here. Of course, I'm checking out every single team that gets submitted through flockfantasy.com in the live streams every single night. And if you wanted to get your team reviewed through one of those streams for free, or if you want to go get that free Joe Burrow pick for the Sunday games, you can find the link to Underdog Fantasy in the description and comment section. Code FLOCK will give you that free Burrow pick, more than less than half total yard. I would want to be pairing that with the Jaden Reed higher than 59.5 receiving yards, and it will get you a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000 and that free team review. And we're doing the live stream every single night. Just make sure you have an account on flockfantasy.com with the same email address as your account on Underdog Fantasy. That way we can hook you up with the free team review voucher. But thank you again. Really do appreciate you, and really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.